Welcome to Conversations About Construction. I'm Dave Trafford. This podcast is produced and presented by the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario. Members of the Alliance build your homes. They build your transportation networks and the systems that deliver safe, clean drinking water to your kitchen sink. This series will focus on industry innovations and solutions that support sustainable economic development and Ontario's world-class standard of living. In this episode, will infrastructure kickstart the post-COVID economy? Our guests today are RCCAO Executive Director Andy Manahan. Paul Smetanin is President and CEO of the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis. And Peter Smith is Executive Director of the Heavy Construction Association of Toronto. So Andy, let's start with you because, you and I have talked over a number of months, over a number of projects, a number of reports that you guys have done at the Alliance. And the underlying tone of so many of these things is that infrastructure is not just the backbone of keeping a municipality or the province or the country moving forward. That's going to be critical in quite effectively standing the economies back up again as we learn to live with COVID and a new economy.
Thanks very much, Dave. Really appreciate you having us on this podcast. We're living through really difficult times right now. There was just a report that came out yesterday, in addition to the report that Paul Smetanin did. RBC was basically talking about the dire straits that municipalities across Canada are in right now. Their revenues have essentially nosedived. If they have transit services, the ridership is way down. If they rely on property taxes or user fees, it's difficult for people to pay those, whether it's commercial or residential. So we're going through some uncharted territory right now. Our view is that infrastructure is really important from a long-term society building perspective. So even though some people might say that, we're getting into this telework environment and we won't need offices in the future and financial districts won't be the same as they used to be and on, we think we still have to keep our eye on the ball and that infrastructure is something that we need to develop for the long term. And that's the case that we're trying to make to governments and other decision makers.
And Paul, I guess this is not, a sort of a new scenario for you, except that we're talking about such an immediate and a quick shock to the system as far as finances are concerned. It begins then to call into question, it's never the same thing as it used to be. We're not going to be able to say we've always done it this way. Infrastructure was a way to build things up. Here we are with huge debts and deficits. Are we going to have the financial wherewithal to get this thing standing back up again?
So in terms of the current crisis, it's happening very quickly. There's a lot of uncertainty. It's very difficult to say what will happen. If we look at what the current government's doing and what other governments are doing around the world, at the moment they're just trying to keep things together. And the question of debt is something that they will think about later. The key issue of the analysis is that infrastructure, even in the midst of scarce resources, which are even more scarce today than what they were a year ago, infrastructure is very important to maintain the investment in infrastructure. Otherwise, we're going to turn a crisis that may have structural implications for the economy. We're going to turn it into a generational impact by virtue of the fact that infrastructure investment started to fall off over this year and the next couple of years ahead.
You begin to wonder whether or not there will be a public question as to whether or not this is money well spent when we consider everything else that's going on. The governments are shoveling billions of dollars out the door every day with programs to support workers and to support employers. And when we begin to look at the hole we're digging, you begin to wonder whether or not there's going to be a public hesitancy to support what otherwise would be a fairly popular idea, and that being infrastructure is a great way to kickstart the economy.
Yeah, I can't speak for what public opinion will be on this particular issue. What I can speak to is that, unfortunately, infrastructure has been a bit of a political football over the last several decades, and its structural and strategic importance has sort of rarely been fully reviewed in the economic and social economic context. And that's what we need to move to. I think that if government have a good understanding of the impact of different kinds of infrastructure and for whom that will benefit and over what time frame, I think that will definitely assist with the education process of both public and also the think tanks that are coming out at the moment and potentially saying, well, too much debt, we need to have some austerity.
Peter, I guess the idea behind all of this, though, is to, almost recreate something on the fly. We are in we can't stop infrastructure. We can't stop the construction processes that are already going on. But while this is all happening, we're in a place where we're going to have to be innovative and maybe even reinvent how we approach infrastructure and large projects in the future.
That's true. And the government has, to its credit, looked at a number of different funding models. The one thing I'd like to say about construction is you spend it here locally. The money, the companies pay taxes locally. The people in skilled trades, so-called blue-collar workers in construction, are very well compensated. Most of them earn six-figure salaries. They like to spend their money at home. Those investments come right back to the community. And certainly I'd like to look at the young people. This COVID is almost going to create a lost generation of students that have sort of left the school system because of COVID. They have no place to go. And working in construction, it's a quick path to a good career. And I think that will help many people find a rewarding career that helps them pay taxes and contribute to society.
Yeah, I guess the whole idea here, though, and Paul, we look at the shock to the system, is what's really being affected here is the tax base. We have more people unemployed now than we've had for decades, maybe in the last century. And similarly, we can say the same thing in the United States, where all of a sudden, where businesses are going out of business, people are losing their jobs. That tax base that we would have relied upon to at least support it in the long-term infrastructure programs is just not there anymore.
Yeah, it's definitely eroding. Our own analysis of the current crisis is the tax base will probably drop by about 20%, 15 to 20% by the end of this year. So it is significant. And it really does beg the question, under such scarce resources, what is the priority in terms of using what revenue does come in? When you think of stimulus is an expense. Stimulus is a short-term holding up economic activity. Infrastructure is an investment. It's basically keeping previous investments at their rates of return and building upon the capacity of the economy and the population to be able to grow in the future. Very quickly, if last year you built a road and this year you don't put in, say, water supply at the end of that road because physical constraints, then what we spent last year on the road doesn't have the economic rate of return that we expected. So it's important to stay the course on infrastructure investment.
I guess, Andy, that also just not only applies to making sure that we keep moving down the road figuratively and literally in Paul's example, but that there's also the whole maintenance issue of existing infrastructure. And as well as anybody, that's an easy item to cut out of budgets at all levels of government.
Yeah, that's an easy item to cut, but it has longer-term consequences because when you repair something that's let to disrepair for many years, it'll cost you more in the long run to fix. I think, what we need to have is a vision. How do we accelerate approvals and have multifunctional designs? For example, if you need a parking lot, can that area be used for, flood mitigation at the same time? So are there ways we can accelerate projects, build things more cost effectively, and just get on with the job? I will say that the federal government in the first term, the Trudeau government, was very slow with respect to its infrastructure program, and we can't afford to be that slow again this time around. There are really important things that need to happen, and I know there's lots of agreements that get signed between the provinces and their municipalities and the federal government, but we can't afford to kind of sit around and have a chat about this. There is important stuff that needs to be done right away. We need to have a big vision for Canada.
Yeah, I guess, Peter, that's the whole idea. The window is going to close very quickly on us, and there's an opportunity here. But unless we are nimble, we're not going to be able to take advantage of it. And by my sense of it, that's not something you could typically apply to government in terms of responding to a situation like this in a nimble and a quick way.
Unfortunately, I think you're correct. It looks to me that this year, this fall, will be a very slow time for the construction industry because governments are hesitant to call jobs. They're talking about letting us know what they're going to call in August, and by the time that's called and everything else, the work isn't going to start in the fall. So this is almost a lost year, and it's unfortunate. But all they had to do was open up the paychecks. There was all kinds of projects, different municipalities, and the provincial level that were, the drawings were ready. They were ready to go. It's just a question of lack of funding. And unfortunately, like Andy says, there's going to be a long pause. And when we look at particularly the federal government, we look at the billions of dollars they commit for infrastructure. And then you go back and look 2 or 3 years later, if it was a $7 billion commitment for infrastructure in 2018, when you go back, we're lucky if they actually can account for half of that spending. So there is a big gap between promises and what's delivered.
So give us a sense then of when you talk about the projects that were shovel ready, as they say. What are the ones that we should have jumped on right away or quickly vis-a-vis that responding quickly?
The easiest ones are every municipality in the province has a list of the things they want to do, whether it's replace a bridge, repave a road, fix up a water treatment plant. And they were making those plans for 2020 at this time last year. Those projects were prioritized. They had consultants working on them. The drawings were prepared. They had tender drawings ready to go. And I was at a major Ontario-wide convention in early February, and there was commitments by the different municipalities across Southern Ontario on what they were going to spend. And these were the projects. They were ready to go. They're just not being called.
Yeah, I guess the harsh reality when we look at the $20 billion deficit we would have for municipalities, it's easy to say, okay, everything's on the back burner right now.
It would be nice to say that there's one super infrastructure project in the province that we should get behind. For example, the Ontario line, and that's a great one. However, if you look at the province as a whole, it's not just Toronto-centric. Every municipality from Northern Ontario, Eastern, South, West, they all have these projects, and the monies that if they were spent this year would be less than, say, one of those super projects, and they would get employment and taxes being generated right across the province.
Mm-hmm. Paul?
Ultimately, it's a question of what your objective is. The state of good repair or the maintenance conversation is a good one because that's truly stimulative. New infrastructure investment is not stimulative. It won't happen in time. I don't believe that there is new infrastructure shovel-ready projects. I'm talking more along the lines of maintenance. It's labor-intensive. Every municipality knows what needs to be fixed. That's truly shovel-ready in that sense, but it's maintenance. Prior to this crisis, we were spending almost half of what we should have on maintenance. And this is an ideal opportunity to begin to refurbish and maintain the infrastructure that we do have. But I do want to reiterate, particularly to the audience, new infrastructure investments are not stimulative. And there's no such thing as shovel-ready new infrastructure investments because they take time to find suppliers, contracts, the politics, and things of that nature. And by the time that happens, you'll find that this crisis will be over.
So, Andy, where's the obstacle then, or the challenge for you as an association to be, knocking on the door for the various levels of government and making Paul's point that, it's great to have the long view and it's nice to have the big check signing up, photo op, but in the meantime, we need to make sure that the money is flowing to get this thing going again.
I guess, first of all, RCCAO is a provincial association, but from time to time we get into federal matters, and this is one of those cases where potentially there's 40% of Ottawa dollars coming to the province of Ontario. So our board thought that it was important. So there are, obviously different points of views with cabinet ministers. The finance minister is looking at debt. The case that Paul makes in his report is that, sure, there will be some upfront dollars, big dollars that have to be spent right now, but the long-term revenues, tax revenues and other benefits accruing from those investments will pay off in terms of jobs, etc. So the argument that we have to make is, beyond whether we make this construction season or not, is let's keep our eye on the ball. So sometimes we'll hear a politician say, in this time of COVID, people are working more remotely. There's certain parts of Canada and Ontario in particular that need broadband. Great project, takes a little while to do, but certainly that's an important project because businesses and the community will need that to be able to do business in a different way in the future. So those are the types of projects. I'm not saying that one politician is more right or more wrong, but they have to get their act together so that in the end they speak with one voice. So Minister McKenna, as Peter might want to say, has a green lens. That's probably really important, but will that slow the delivery of certain projects that we really need to get going on?
Yeah, I guess, Peter, then we get into the whole question around regulation, because that is often thrown up as this is great, we got an approved project, but by the time we go through all the various regulations, environmental assessments such as they are, that bogs it down even further, and I guess probably makes Paul's point pretty well.
So I would absolutely agree with you, and Andy is our expert on, we'll call it municipal environmental assessments. We had a case a couple of years ago where the town of Caledon wanted to replace two fairly small bridges just on we'll call it a maintenance type replacement. And the actual capital cost to construct those bridges was around $500,000 for each bridge. Yet the environmental assessment to basically replicate what was there was over $1 million in each case. So you spend double the cost to replace a bridge more or less than the actual cost to replace it just on the environmental issues. So those are the things that we need to change. And the municipality itself was saying that this is a huge impediment between money and time. Bridges that need to be repaired should be repaired. And it should be a lot easier to basically do a replacement bridge than start a brand new project in a virgin area.
Paul, when you look at these numbers and you do your reporting, and I know you guys are in the field doing this kind of stuff often and regularly, when you look down the road here, I realize that you've almost given us a snapshot with options of where we are, but what do we need to see happen in the next 6, 18, 36 months to make sure that we're on something of a path that appears to be a path of recovery and the role of infrastructure there?
Okay, well, I think the first thing that needs to happen is cooperation across the three levels of government that we have in Canada. We're living the failure of governance. We have for decades, and this crisis is really bringing out that failure. That's the first point. Second point is with municipal operating deficits, there is the risk of capital budgets being used to actually pay for operating deficits, and that's a significant concern. When we did our 2010 report, we demonstrated that the deficit investment in infrastructure was costing a person that starts work at the age of 20, it's costing them about $365,000 over their lifetime through lost wages. And so this is the long-term perspective of infrastructure, and we can't ignore that. Right now, we're under a crisis that's short-term, and within the same governance framework, and that's why we've structured the analysis and report that we have. This isn't sort of, I don't see the federal government handing money directly to municipalities. It's not within the governance framework. But infrastructure is the goose that lays a golden egg for the federal government because it builds upon the income taxes the federal government receives in the future. And so what we've done within this analysis is essentially combined what is the win-win for all three levels of government, and that's participation, and that's the federal government coming to the provinces and assisting with their capital budgets, such as the provinces can assist municipalities with their operating deficits.
So, and it sounds like a great grand choreography that has to happen then, and I would be curious to get all three of your perspectives on how we, make sure that the piper's playing the right tune, Peter.
Well, I think Paul is absolutely right. Municipalities are legally not allowed to go into deficit, and with all the reduction, as Andy said, in their revenues, but the demand to provide all the services, they're in a real jackpot, and I'm quite certain that they are dipping into the monies that they'd set aside for whatever projects they were going to do this year, be it maintenance or infrastructure, and that's impacting our industry. And unfortunately, there's no way around it unless the province can help fund, and the province, because of we'll say the situation they're in, is unable to borrow money at a competitive rate, and they have to look to the feds. So it is a trickle-down economy, to borrow an old phrase.
I guess, Andy, to extend the metaphor, it's almost like musical chairs. Somebody's going to be left without a chair if we're not careful.
Well, Dave, there's an interesting dynamic happening right now. The Federation of Canadian Municipalities came out with a report recently that said this year alone, 2020, $10 to $15 billion is required at the municipal level for their projects. And Paul's CANCEA organization confirmed that was a legitimate figure. So the interesting dynamic is that the federal government is actually talking directly to FCM about allocation of dollars. So in this case, they might be bypassing the provinces to get the money out the door a little bit faster. So I'm not saying whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it is a good thing if it gets the money out the door faster.
Thought on that, Paul?
Yeah, I think it's fraught with risk. I think that the current governance framework still needs to be respected. I think that by going around the provincial government causes another dimension of non-cooperation, because we've got to remember that this is not just about municipalities and their capital budgets. You've also got the provinces and their capital budgets. And essentially, there is an ideal opportunity here in terms of money is required to help municipalities in their operating deficits at the moment. There's an opportunity for all three levels of government to come to a basic understanding that protects our long-term future, but also provides a way to provide vital services that are going to be required over the next several years for municipal operating deficits. I struggle to see how the federal government is going to give municipalities money because they're not, I don't think that they will be sure what they're signing up for, because it's not just this year, there'll be next year and the year after and the year after. So in order to give this the path of least resistance and the highest probability of succeeding, I feel that we should be within the same governance framework that had existed prior to this crisis.
Yeah, and I think it's Andy, when you consider that by backdooring into the municipalities, you may inadvertently be creating another obstacle for getting that promise fulfilled down the road.
Well, this gets us back into the who does what, and it seems every generation has a big discussion about what's the role of the federal government vis-a-vis the province and municipalities. For smaller provinces, unlike Ontario, we do have a very robust municipal sector with 444 local governments. So they're of all sizes, shapes, everything else, and that does create a challenge for us. So it's always going to be a challenge, but maybe, use this crisis as an opportunity to figure out what's the best role for all those levels of government. Typically, health is looked after by the provinces, but in this case, COVID is a national pandemic. So what's the role of the federal government other than standing up there every day and saying, we're listening to our chief medical officers of health and they're telling us what to do? But are there other roles from the bricks and mortar or virtual care kind of, prognosis that can help us out here?
Yeah, I guess, Peter, the whole idea being that you want to take a look at that and say, it's hard to change your priorities. Well, the whole line about you're up to your ass in alligators because your first thought was you were supposed to be there to drain the swamp, right?
I get the analogy. So I guess I'm going to disagree slightly with Paul. Our prime minister some weeks ago said this was almost like a wartime decision-making mentality. And if you're going to free up funds, what is a better time to free up funds? We're spending $3 billion plus a week on CERB, and isn't it better to fund those municipalities across Canada and get people back to work and paying taxes as opposed to receiving monies and stimulating the economy, because they're paying the taxes, but the contractors are buying local supplies, people are going in and spending a bit more money. That's the way to make it happen. And if you can't spend the money now, why not?
As I listen to this, I realize, okay, there's a whole logic to this process, that it all makes sense, that on paper, I understand that the stimulus is going to be the immediate maintenance of infrastructure. Longer term, to create stability in the economy, we want the bigger projects. But we don't seem to have the bandwidth as far as government attention, undivided attention to this issue as we might otherwise have. So, Peter, should I be optimistic in your view, or I'm going to have to buckle up and ride this out?
I'm saying that my take on the third and fourth quarter, it's not going to be optimistic.
Paul?
Well, we do infectious disease modelling over the last 12 years and economics and a whole bunch of other things, and we're guaranteed to have a second wave without public health intervention. Epidemiologists have known this for the last couple of months. So we see that there is a lot of risk in the system. We see, and it really will depend upon how public health and politicians respond to the resurgence of COVID-19, which will certainly take hold in September. So, we are expecting probably to see about a 14 to 16% unemployment rate by the end of this year.
Andy, final thought to you?
I'm also an optimist by nature, but in this case, a realist. So I think it will be difficult to get infrastructure funds out the door. However, in the big picture, society has bounced back from plagues and pestilence in the past, and I'm confident we're going to be able to do this, and we'll lick this thing, this COVID pandemic.
Yeah, well, typically all of that comes at a cost. So we'll, what are we prepared to pay out, and how patient are we likely to be? So we'll have to have this conversation in 6 months from now, just to see how the attitudes may be affecting some of the numbers that you're seeing, Paul. Peter, Paul, Andy, this has been an enjoyable discussion. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Conversations About Construction, and we'd encourage you to subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts and share it with your network. Conversations About Construction is produced for the Residential and Civil Construction Alliance of Ontario by Eye Contact Productions. I'm Dave Trafford.